It began with a silence so thick it felt like the air itself had weight. Prince Harry sat in a private drawing room, the sort of space reserved for conversations that could never appear in the pages of history books, at least not until decades later. Outside, the gardens lay in a deceptive calm, the wind stirring leaves that danced and whispered in patterns only nature could understand. Inside, the clock on the mantel ticked with an irritating precision, each second sounding like an impatient reminder that the truth was coming whether he wanted it or not. For years, whispers had chased Harry through corridors both royal and public. Schoolmates who smirked behind his back, tabloid headlines dressed up as questions but dripping with accusation, anonymous comments on internet forums. Each carried the same insinuation, that the man he called father might not be his father at all. He had dismissed them publicly and privately, sometimes with anger, sometimes with weary humor, sometimes ignoring them altogether. He told himself they were born from spite and ignorance. Yet somewhere deep down, he knew the persistence of a rumor often comes from the grain of something more. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, across from him, King Charles sat not as the sovereign, but as a man burdened by something that had weighed on him far longer than anyone suspected. The monarch's posture was straight, his gaze steady, but there was a heaviness in his expression, an unspoken acknowledgement that this conversation would change the course of Harry's life in ways neither of them could predict. Charles's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a rare display of nerves. Harry had come to this meeting thinking it might be about yet another family dispute. Perhaps something to do with royal duties, public statements, or even Meghan. He was ready for the usual restrained confrontation, the kind where politeness masked frustration. Instead, he was met with an atmosphere that felt colder, denser, more final. There was no preamble, no warm catch-up about the children, just an unspoken understanding that the next few minutes would either heal or irrevocably shatter something between them. To understand the weight of this moment, one must remember the unique life Harry has lived. Born into the monarchy but never quite fitting its mold, he has navigated a world of ceremonial duties, private rebellions, and public scrutiny. His childhood, though privileged, was fractured by the loss of his mother at an age when the concept of permanence should have been unshakable. Princess Diana's death left him clinging to the fragments of family he had left, and one of those fragments was Charles. No matter their differences, Charles was a constant, a figure tied to blood and history. That constant was about to be ripped away, not by scandal in the press, but by words spoken in the quiet of a private room. Before Charles spoke, Harry's mind drifted involuntarily to memories of his mother, her laugh, her warmth, the way she bent down to his level when she spoke to him, as though every word mattered. He thought of the times she mentioned friends whose names were later dissected in the tabloids, James Hewitt among them. As a boy, Harry never questioned timelines or rumors. As a man, he had learned to question everything. Still, some questions were too dangerous to ask outright. Charles began to speak, his voice lower than usual, his eyes fixed not on Harry but somewhere beyond, as though he was trying to gather strength from the space between them. Harry braced himself for criticism, for advice he didn't want, perhaps even an apology for years of distance. What he heard instead was a slow, deliberate confession that made his chest tighten. The words were carefully chosen, but they carried the force of a blow. Harry's world shifted in that instant. Everything he thought was fixed, his place in the family, the man he thought of as his father, was now under question. It was not just the information itself that hurt, but the source of it. This was not something overheard in a gossip column or leaked by a so-called insider. This was from the lips of the man who had raised him, who had walked beside him in moments of public grief, who had stood with him on the most formal of occasions. The first reaction was disbelief. It wasn't possible, he told himself. Too much had been invested in the life he knew. But the way Charles looked at him, steady, sad, resolute, left no room for denial. Harry's second reaction was anger, sharp and sudden. If this was true, why had it taken so long to be said? Why had he been allowed to endure years of speculation without defense or clarity? And if it was untrue, why would his father even give life to such a claim? He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but his throat felt constricted. For a moment, he was no longer a prince, no longer a husband or a father, just a son being told that the story of his life might be based on a lie. The clock ticked on, oblivious to the shift in reality. In the middle of this storm, Harry's mind began racing through possibilities. If this revelation went beyond the walls of the room, the impact would be seismic, not only on him but on the monarchy itself. The press would feast on it. His detractors would weaponize it. Even supporters might see him differently. Every smile, every royal duty performed, every public moment with Charles could be reinterpreted under a new, more painful lens. Yet there was also a deeper, more personal wound. Identity is not just a matter of birth, but of belonging. If Charles was not his biological father, what did that make the years of shared history? Were they invalidated, or did they still hold the same weight? Was blood truly more defining than love, duty, or shared experience? These were not questions for public consumption, but for private reckoning. Charles's voice eventually faded into silence, and the room seemed smaller, the walls closer. Harry realized the conversation had reached its end, at least for now. There would be no immediate resolution, no quick comfort. He was left with the truth, or a version of it, and the burden of deciding what to do next. Outside, the world went on as if nothing had happened, but inside, everything had changed. The drive back from the meeting was a blur. London streets, usually familiar, seemed alien. He glanced at the faces of strangers and wondered how many of them carried their own family secrets, how many had been blindsided by revelations they never saw coming. He thought of Meghan, of how he would tell her, and of how she might respond, with compassion, with outrage, with a plan to control the narrative before it escaped their grasp. By the time he reached home, the weight of the news had settled heavily on him. There was no escaping it. It would be there when he woke the next morning, when he faced the cameras, when he looked at his children. The truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. And yet, even in the midst of pain, there was a part of him that needed to know more. If this was real, if James Hewitt was truly his biological father, what did that mean for the life he had led and the man he had become? Was his path ever really his own, or had it been shaped entirely by forces beyond his control? The answers would not come quickly, and some might never come at all. As night fell, Harry stood by a window, staring out at the darkened city. The lights below flickered like fragments of certainty in a sea of doubt. Somewhere in the distance, life continued as normal, oblivious to the fracture that had opened in his. In the quiet, he knew one thing for certain. Nothing about his life would ever be the same again. Rumors, once born, rarely die in the world of royalty. They mutate, they travel, they re-emerge when the moment is most inconvenient, and for decades, one particular rumor clung to Prince Harry like a shadow he could never outrun. Long before social media amplified speculation into a deafening roar, whispers were already passing between lips at high society parties, in the back rooms of newsrooms, and among palace staff who knew more than they ever dared to say in public. It was a story too tantalizing to ignore, that the young prince, with his reddish hair and easy smile, was not truly the son of the man the world knew as his father. The earliest iterations of the rumor came in the 1990s, back when Harry was still at school, and the press feasted daily on the smallest hints of scandal. Photographs comparing him to James Hewitt began to circulate, side by side with images of King Charles. The resemblance to Hewitt was undeniable to some eyes. The color of the hair, the curve of the smile, even the shape of the jaw. The timeline of Hewitt's relationship with Princess Diana was picked apart endlessly by tabloids, each claiming exclusive insight into when it began and whether it overlapped with the period before Harry's birth. For Harry, these were not just idle stories on the front page of a paper. They became the jokes whispered in corridors at Eton, the sly remarks from journalists during photo calls, the offhand comments from strangers who felt entitled to question his identity. In public, he ignored them. In private, he buried them so deeply that even thinking about the possibility felt like disloyalty to the man who had raised him. Princess Diana herself addressed the rumor in her lifetime, stating firmly that her relationship with Hewitt began after Harry's birth. Yet her words were not enough to silence the speculation. If anything, denials seemed to feed the gossip further, as though the very act of addressing it confirmed that the topic was worth discussing. Hewitt, too, made statements over the years, sometimes laughing off the claim, other times expressing frustration at the damage it did to his own life. But the truth, or the perception of it, remained elusive. Meanwhile, the press continued to sharpen the story whenever there was a lull in royal drama. When Harry joined the military, headlines resurfaced about his supposed real father's career in the armed forces, suggesting a hereditary link to his own service. When he appeared at charity events, the comparison photographs would inevitably reappear on social media, reigniting debates that had never truly ended. Inside palace walls, the matter was treated with a mixture of irritation and avoidance. Advisors understood that addressing the rumor directly risked lending it legitimacy. The official stance was silence, a tactic that had served the monarchy well in other controversies but which, in this case, allowed the narrative to survive for decades. Charles never spoke publicly about it, and in the rare moments when it surfaced in conversation, the mood shifted quickly, as though an invisible line had been crossed. This silence left room for the rumor to grow in the minds of the public. Each year brought new commentary from royal biographers, former aides, and so-called insiders, some of whom claimed to have been in the room when private conversations occurred, others who said they had seen documents or letters confirming one version of events or another. Many of these claims contradicted each other, but that didn't matter to an audience hungry for scandal. In the court of public opinion, consistency was less important than intrigue. Harry learned to carry himself as though he was untouched by the speculation. He cultivated a sense of humor about public perception, often joking about his hair color or his supposed rebellious streak. But those close to him knew that there were lines he did not cross in conversation, topics that could change his expression from open and warm to closed and guarded in an instant. Even as he built his own life, married Meghan, and stepped back from royal duties, the shadow of the rumor remained, following him across continents. The cruelest part of it all was that the speculation often intensified at moments when Harry's personal life was already under strain. When tensions between him and the royal family became public, when his interviews criticized the institution, or when Meghan became the target of relentless tabloid attacks, the old story about James Hewitt would suddenly resurface, as though to question not only Harry's place in the family, but his right to speak as one of them. It was a weapon, and those who wielded it knew exactly what they were doing. And yet, behind closed doors, even those who believed the rumor understood the stakes of acknowledging it. A monarchy rests not only on tradition and pageantry, but on the perception of continuity. To admit that one of its most visible members was not who the world thought he was would risk undermining the entire structure. This was not just about Harry's personal identity. It was about the institution's survival. There were moments over the years when Harry considered confronting his father directly about the speculation to demand an unequivocal answer. But each time, something stopped him. Perhaps it was the fear of hearing confirmation. Perhaps it was the desire to preserve the relationship he still valued, however complicated it might be. There is a certain safety in uncertainty. As long as the truth remains unspoken, it can be shaped into something one can live with. This uneasy balance could not last forever. The rumor had been a slow burn for decades, but in recent years, with the advent of viral media and an increasingly fractured royal family, it had become a spark dangerously close to open flame. All it needed was the right moment, the right tension, and the right words from the right person to transform it from speculation into something irreversible. And that moment was coming. The story of Diana and James Hewitt's connection is one of those chapters in royal history that refuses to fade, partly because it was lived out in a time when the media's appetite for royal intrigue was insatiable, and partly because it contains just enough truth to keep speculation alive. To understand the weight of the revelation Harry would one day face, it's necessary to go back to the beginning, to the moment when their paths first crossed, and how what began as a chance meeting evolved into one of the most controversial relationships of the modern monarchy. It was the mid-1980s, and Princess Diana was already an icon. She was still young, barely into her 20s, yet she carried the crushing weight of royal expectations with a grace that drew the world's admiration. Beneath the public image, however, her marriage to Prince Charles was under strain. The fairy tale that had captivated millions was fraying behind palace walls. Charles's long-standing attachment to Camilla Parker Bowles had become an open secret in certain circles, and Diana, isolated in her role, was seeking companionship and emotional connection in places far removed from the cold formalities of the court. James Hewitt was a cavalry officer in the British Army, with a polished charm and the kind of confidence that comes naturally to men accustomed to regimented authority and ceremonial duty. He met Diana at a time when she was vulnerable, struggling with the disintegration of her marriage and the loneliness of palace life. Accounts vary on the exact circumstances of their introduction. Some say it was at a formal gathering where Hewitt was introduced as a riding instructor. Others claim it was through mutual friends who thought he could offer Diana an outlet away from the suffocating world of royal protocol. What is clear is that their connection was immediate. Hewitt was attentive, charismatic, and, perhaps most importantly to Diana, a good listener. In a world where her words were often filtered, measured, and dissected, she found in him someone who seemed to listen without judgment. Riding lessons became the cover for their growing closeness, giving them the perfect excuse to meet regularly without arousing suspicion, at least at first. Over time, their relationship deepened. Former staff members have recalled the warmth between them, the private smiles, the ease with which they spoke when they thought no one was watching. For Diana, Hewitt offered a refuge from the tensions of royal life, someone who seemed willing to protect her from the storm that often raged around her. For Hewitt, the connection with Diana was intoxicating. She was not only the most famous woman in the world, but also someone who, despite her status, seemed to genuinely need him. Of course, secrecy was essential. The British press in the 1980s was relentless, and even the smallest hint of impropriety could ignite a scandal capable of damaging reputations beyond repair. Their meetings were carefully arranged, often away from London, in the countryside where the chances of prying eyes were fewer. But secrecy has a way of unraveling, especially when emotions intensify and the world around you is filled with people eager to profit from a whispered truth. When the relationship finally became public knowledge in the 1990s, after Diana and Charles had separated, it was a bombshell. Hewitt did not deny the connection, and Diana, in her famous Panorama interview, admitted to the affair, though she insisted it began years after Harry's birth. The admission was explosive, not only because it confirmed the long-rumored liaison, but because it gave ammunition to those who had been speculating about Harry's paternity. Still, the emotional cost of living in this space between connection and loss took its toll. There were quiet nights when Jeff would sit alone after visiting her, replaying their interactions in his mind. He would think about the things he wished he had said, the stories he hoped she would remember, the reassurance he wanted to give her but feared she might not understand. In those moments, the image of the unstoppable entrepreneur gave way to that of a son trying to navigate the slow, uneven process of saying goodbye. These years were a crucible for the family, a time when love and frustration coexisted in the same breath, when unity and disagreement were constantly in tension. The strain was not born of indifference or neglect, but of the relentless pressure of trying to honor someone's dignity while confronting a disease that stripped away so much of who they had been. It was in this environment, heavy with both care and conflict, that the later meaning of Jeff's public statement began to take shape. Every choice made, every quiet disagreement, every moment of clarity and confusion was part of the unspoken story behind those few words that would one day leave the world stunned. Opens with a question that Jeff Bezos found himself confronting again and again during those years. What is the point of great wealth if it cannot shield you from the most personal of tragedies? In business, Jeff had learned that resources meant options, the ability to acquire talent, invest in innovation, and outmaneuver competitors. In the face of his mother's dementia, those same resources could buy only comfort and care, never a cure. The disease operated outside the reach of influence, moving at its own pace, immune to negotiation or persuasion. The best doctors in the world were consulted. Specialists from across the country were flown in to evaluate Jackie's condition, their reputations built on decades of research and treatment. Cutting-edge therapies were explored, each one offering a glimmer of hope that quickly dimmed in the face of reality. Even experimental treatments, accessible only to those with the means to pay staggering costs, failed to halt the steady erosion of her memory. the family learned to temper expectations. Each new appointment was met with cautious optimism, followed by the quiet disappointment of hearing that the disease remained unshaken. The home was transformed into a space designed for both safety and familiarity. State-of-the-art monitoring systems ensured she was never alone in a moment of distress. Discreet cameras allowed caregivers to keep an eye on her without intruding on her privacy. Rooms were arranged so she could navigate them with ease, furniture placed to prevent accidents, hallways lit softly at night to guide her if she woke disoriented. Every detail was considered, every possibility accounted for. Yet no matter how advanced the setup, no matter how perfectly executed the plan, the one thing Jeff wanted most, to restore his mother's mind, remained out of reach. There was an almost cruel irony in the situation. Jeff's entire professional identity was built around solving complex problems and finding new frontiers to conquer. He had built companies that could deliver goods to millions overnight, design reusable rockets, and revolutionize the way people shopped. But here, in the most personal battle of his life, he was powerless. The lesson was as sharp as it was painful. Money can amplify your reach, but it cannot rewrite the laws of nature. For Jackie, the luxury her son's wealth provided did mean she could remain in the comfort of her own home for far longer than most patients in her condition. She was surrounded by familiar spaces, tended to by highly trained professionals, and supported by a family that had the means to give her the best care possible. But even this came with challenges. The presence of so many people, nurses, aides, therapists, was at times overwhelming for her. On good days, she welcomed their company. On bad days, she withdrew, her eyes narrowing at the strangers in her home. This unpredictability made it clear that even the most well-intentioned arrangements could not smooth over every difficulty. The emotional cost for Jeff was more than he anticipated. He had thought that ensuring her comfort would bring him peace, that knowing she was receiving the best care available would be enough. Instead, it often felt like he was watching a slow, inevitable loss play out from the front row. Each visit became a test of his own resilience. There were moments when she looked at him with the same warmth and recognition she always had, and he would feel a fleeting sense of relief. But those moments were increasingly rare, and each one carried the bittersweet knowledge that it might be the last. There were also times when the strain of the situation clashed with the demands of his public life. High-profile commitments meant he couldn't always be physically present, and this absence weighed on him. No matter how carefully he balanced his schedule, there were moments he missed, moments when she was lucid enough to share a meaningful conversation, or when she asked for him specifically. Each missed opportunity lingered in his mind, feeding a quiet guilt that even his closest friends rarely saw. This guilt was compounded by the public perception of his life. To the world, Jeff Bezos appeared untouchable, a figure whose wealth insulated him from the ordinary hardships of existence. In reality, he was dealing with the same helplessness faced by countless families coping with dementia, except his situation played out under the shadow of global attention. He could not simply disappear from public view without raising questions, yet every public appearance pulled him away from the private reality that demanded so much of his heart. The disparity between the resources he could provide and the limitations of those resources became a recurring theme in his thoughts. It made him question the true meaning of success and the role wealth should play in one's life. These were not questions he had the time or luxury to dwell on during his earlier career, when everything was measured in growth, market share, and innovation. Now, they pressed on him daily, reshaping his perspective on what really mattered. And then there was the tension that wealth sometimes created within the family itself. The question of how to allocate resources, which treatments to try, and what level of care was most appropriate was not always met with agreement. While the financial strain that often accompanies such situations for ordinary families was not present here, the decisions themselves still carried emotional weight. Every choice felt like a gamble with her comfort and dignity at stake. As the months turned into years, Jeff began to understand that there would be no triumphant breakthrough, no dramatic reversal of her condition. The most they could do was slow the decline, preserve her comfort, and treasure the moments of connection that remained. It was a humbling realization for a man who had spent his life believing in the power of human ingenuity to overcome any obstacle. In the end, The wealth that had seemed so vast in every other context was revealed to be finite in the ways that mattered most. It could not buy back time. It could not restore memories. It could not stop the disease from advancing. What it could do, what it did do, was provide a cushion against some of the harsher realities of illness. But in the quiet moments, when Jeff sat with his mother and watched her drift into silence, the comfort of that cushion felt thin. These were the truths that shaped not only his grief, but also the way he would one day speak about her passing. The lesson that even the most powerful are not immune to loss was no longer abstract. It was lived, felt, and carried into the core of who he was. And while the world would later hear only fragments of this story, those closest to him understood that behind his measured public words was the weight of these years. Years when money could do almost everything except the one thing he truly wanted. Begins in the quiet, tense air of family meetings that were never meant for public ears. These were not the grand gatherings that marked holidays or birthdays, but small, often unplanned conferences around kitchen tables and in private living rooms, where the topic of discussion was never easy. The subject was always the same: how to care for Jackie in the way she deserved, and what the right way truly meant. What might have started as a shared goal became, over time, a point of friction that tested the bonds between those who loved her most. The disputes were rarely loud or explosive. They lived instead in the pauses, in the exchanged glances, in the way voices would tighten when opinions diverged. On one side were those who believed her illness demanded total withdrawal from public life. They argued that the risk of her being caught in a moment of confusion in front of cameras was too great, that her dignity should be preserved at all costs, even if it meant shielding her completely from public view. On the other side were those who felt that removing her entirely from the world she had known and loved would be an injustice. They believed her presence at certain family events was worth the effort, that even brief appearances could give her moments of connection and joy. Jeff often found himself caught between these perspectives. He understood the need to protect her privacy, but he also knew his mother's personality. She had never been someone who shied away from people, and even as her memory faltered, there were flashes of her old self when she was surrounded by family and familiar faces. To deny her that seemed wrong, but to risk her experiencing confusion or distress in a public setting felt equally cruel. Every decision carried the possibility of regret. These debates extended beyond public appearances to the details of her daily life. How strict should her schedule be? Should caregivers take the lead in structuring her day, or should they adapt to her moods and energy levels? One camp believed in the consistency of a fixed routine, arguing it would help orient her. Another believed flexibility was more humane, allowing her to move at her own pace without feeling pressured. These disagreements, though grounded in love and concern, sometimes left wounds that took weeks to fade. Adding to the complexity were the differences in how each family member processed the emotional weight of her illness. Some dealt with it by being as present and hands-on as possible, visiting daily, helping with small tasks, and spending long stretches of quiet time with her. Others, overwhelmed by the pain of seeing her decline, visited less often, choosing to remember her as she had been rather than watch her transformation up close. These different coping mechanisms could easily be misinterpreted as a lack of care, leading to tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Jeff, who was used to having the final word in high-stakes business decisions, found himself in unfamiliar territory here. In the corporate world, disagreements could be resolved with data, projections, and clear hierarchies. In matters of family and illness, there were no charts to consult, no bottom lines to reference. The right choice was often a matter of perspective, and everyone's perspective was shaped by their own emotional relationship to Jackie. The disputes also revealed deeper, long-standing differences in family dynamics, differences that might have remained dormant had it not been for the pressure of the situation. Old disagreements resurfaced, sometimes in subtle ways. A disagreement about a care schedule might carry the weight of past slights or unresolved conflicts from years earlier. The illness did not create these underlying tensions, but it gave them new relevance, forcing everyone to confront them in the present. Jeff tried to keep the focus on Jackie, reminding everyone that the purpose of these discussions was her comfort and dignity. But even he felt the strain. His role as the most public member of the family came with its own pressures. Anything that went wrong, whether it was a public appearance that ended awkwardly or a change in her care plan that caused discomfort, risked being traced back to him in the public narrative. The burden of that responsibility was heavy, and it sometimes made him cautious to the point of frustration for those who wanted more decisive action. These behind-the-scenes conflicts were invisible to the outside world. Publicly, the family appeared united, presenting a calm and composed front whenever Jackie was mentioned. But in the privacy of their homes, the weight of constant decision-making was eroding the ease of their interactions. Simple family moments were harder to come by, because every gathering carried with it the unspoken knowledge that another difficult conversation was inevitable. The situation also forced Jeff to confront the limits of his own control. In business, he could shape outcomes by applying pressure in the right places, allocating resources, or changing strategy. In his mother's care, there were moments when no amount of effort could lead to a satisfying resolution. He could not control her reactions to certain situations, nor could he predict the progression of her disease with any precision. This lack of control was perhaps the most difficult reality for him to accept. As the illness progressed, the frequency of these disagreements diminished, not because everyone had reached an understanding, but because the decisions themselves became fewer. Jackie's world grew smaller, her ability to participate in events dwindling until it was clear she would no longer attend them at all. The debates about public appearances ended, replaced by quieter discussions about how to keep her comfortable in her own home. Yet the echoes of those earlier tensions remained, shaping the way family members interacted with each other long after the immediate issues had passed. These years left an imprint not just on Jeff's relationship with his mother, but on his relationships with the rest of his family. Bonds that had once seemed unshakable now carried the marks of these unspoken battles. And while love remained, it was layered with the knowledge that even the closest families are not immune to strain when faced with the relentless demands of a long and difficult illness. This chapter in their story, though rarely acknowledged outside their private circles, was essential to understanding the quiet weight behind Jeff's later words. When he spoke publicly after her passing, the world heard only the statement. But for those who had been in those kitchens, those living rooms, those long and weary conversations, the meaning ran far deeper. Chapter 7 begins in the uneasy space where public image and private reality collide. For most families coping with dementia, the experience unfolds quietly, away from scrutiny. But for Jeff Bezos, whose life had been lived under a relentless spotlight for decades, privacy was never truly possible. Every appearance, every absence, every carefully worded statement was examined, analyzed, and dissected by a global audience. As his mother's illness progressed, the isolation created by his fame became another layer of strain that shaped not just his own emotional world, but the entire family's experience. Public curiosity about Jackie was inevitable. She had been a supporting figure in the mythology of Jeff's rise, the mother who raised a boy with big dreams in modest circumstances, whose encouragement and belief in him had been part of countless interviews. The public remembered photographs of her at early Amazon events, standing beside her son with a proud smile. When she began to appear less frequently, the absence did not go unnoticed. Rumors began to circulate in quiet corners of the media. Some speculated that she had grown disinterested in public life, while others suggested strained family relations. These narratives were born out of ignorance, but they carried weight in an environment where perception often overshadows truth. Jeff knew that explaining her condition to the world might put an end to the speculation, but doing so would mean exposing her in ways she might not want. Dementia, as he understood well, was not just a medical diagnosis. It was a deeply personal experience, and publicly labeling her could change how people treated her forever. The irony was that his wealth and power, which might have shielded him from some forms of intrusion, in this case intensified it. Public fascination with the Bezos family meant that any deviation from the expected narrative was an opportunity for gossip. The more he guarded her privacy, the more curious people became. This curiosity created a strange kind of isolation. Even within social circles, there was a sense that conversations could not be fully candid. Friends and acquaintances, unsure of how much they were allowed to know, often avoided the subject entirely, leaving Jeff to navigate his grief in a quiet, internal way. Events that might have been simple family moments in the past now required careful orchestration. If Jackie attended a gathering, every detail had to be considered. How long she could comfortably stay, how to manage the flow of people around her, how to ensure she would not become disoriented. If she was absent, there had to be a plausible explanation ready in case anyone asked. This constant calculation drained the joy from occasions that should have been lighthearted. The effort to manage appearances for the public and the extended social network was relentless. For Jeff, there was also the challenge of separating his roles. In public, he was expected to be confident, decisive, and forward-looking, the face of ambitious projects and bold ventures. In private, he was dealing with the slow erosion of a relationship that had defined much of his life. Switching between those identities sometimes felt like an impossible task. There were days when he walked onto a stage to deliver a keynote address with the weight of a difficult morning still heavy on his mind. In those moments, the applause and attention felt distant, almost irrelevant. There was also an unspoken loneliness in knowing that so few people could truly understand the complexity of his situation. For the average person, grief is shared among friends and family without fear of it becoming a headline. For Jeff, every choice carried the risk of public misinterpretation. Speaking about his mother's illness openly could invite sympathy, but it could also lead to invasive questions, or worse, opportunistic narratives from those looking to use the story for their own purposes. Remaining silent preserved some control, but it also meant carrying much of the burden alone. The isolation extended to his interactions with the media. In interviews, he became adept at steering conversations away from his personal life, but the effort was noticeable to those who paid attention. A question about family would be met with a polite but brief answer, followed quickly by a pivot back to business. For those who didn't know the reality, this might have seemed like the guardedness of a man uncomfortable with intimacy. For those who did, it was a shield, one necessary to protect someone who could no longer protect herself. It began not with a press release, not with the kind of orchestrated media moment that often surrounds the world's most powerful and public figures, but with a silence so heavy it seemed to hang in the air for days. When news broke that Jackie Bezos, the mother of Jeff Bezos, had passed away, there was no immediate statement from her famous son, no carefully worded tribute filled with corporate polish, no instant photograph shared to his millions of followers. Only an absence, one that invited questions, speculation, and a gnawing curiosity about what was unfolding behind the closed doors of one of the wealthiest families in the world. For most people, the death of a parent is an intensely private matter. But for Jeff Bezos, a man whose every move has been dissected by the press for decades, privacy is a luxury rarely granted. And yet, in those first hours after Jackie's passing, Bezos seemed determined to maintain it. Days passed, and still he said nothing. The silence was not just notable, it was deafening. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't the boardrooms, the rockets, or the billion-dollar deals dominating his story. It was something far more human and far more fragile, the loss of a mother and the complicated emotions that came with it. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Jackie Bezos was not a figure most of the public knew well. She had appeared occasionally in stories about Jeff's childhood, described as a supportive, determined mother who raised her son with ambition and resilience. In interviews, Jeff often credited her with instilling in him the values that fueled his success. She was painted as fiercely devoted to her children, a woman who, in the face of hardship, chose to push forward with quiet strength. And yet, in the final years of her life, the reality behind the public image began to shift in ways that were almost invisible to the outside world, but deeply felt within the family. The first hints of trouble came long before her passing. Whispers in close circles suggested Jackie was grappling with memory loss, the kind that starts small, like forgetting where you put the keys, but gradually begins to reshape every conversation, every relationship, every part of life. Dementia, that cruel and unforgiving thief, had begun its slow invasion. For a family that valued privacy and control, the diagnosis wasn't just a medical reality. It was a threat to the very image they had spent decades cultivating. There were moments, according to those who had known the family for years, when Jackie would forget simple details about her son's life, forgetting meetings they'd planned, stories he'd told her just days before, or even the names of close family members. For Jeff, a man so precise and calculated in every aspect of his business life, it was a pain he couldn't simply outthink or outplan. You can negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions, design spacecraft to reach the edge of space, and build a company that changes the world, but you cannot outmaneuver the steady erosion of memory in someone you love. Behind closed doors, the situation grew more complicated. Caring for someone with dementia is never straightforward, but in families with wealth, influence, and intense public scrutiny, the stakes are different. There are not only medical decisions to be made, but also reputational ones. Should the public know about her condition? How would the press react if photos emerged showing her confusion in a public setting? Would it lead to a frenzy of tabloid speculation, the kind that could overshadow her dignity in her final years? These were questions that reportedly fueled heated conversations within the family. In the end, the family kept her condition mostly private. There were public appearances where she smiled, waved, and stood beside her son at charity events, but insiders claimed that these moments were carefully managed, sometimes lasting only a few minutes before she was ushered away. The tension this created in the family was undeniable. Some members believed she should be protected from public life entirely. Others felt she would want to be present, even if only for brief appearances. Disagreements over her care reportedly caused deep rifts, the kind that are difficult to heal, even in times of mourning. And so, when Jackie passed, the silence from Jeff Bezos was not just the silence of grief. It was the silence of someone processing a complicated, layered loss, one that had been preceded by years of gradual farewells, each one taking a piece of his mother away long before her final breath. To the public, it might have seemed like a sudden, shocking event. But for those close to the situation, her passing marked the end of a long chapter defined by quiet struggles and unspoken pain. When Bezos finally broke his silence, the statement was brief, almost restrained. But hidden within his words were phrases that stood out to those who listened closely. He spoke of chapters closing, of lessons learned through hardship, of love mixed with complexity. There was no flowery language, no exhaustive list of accomplishments. Instead, there was a sense of release, almost as if her passing had lifted a weight that had been pressing on him for years. It was a tone that surprised many, not because it was cold, but because it hinted at a reality more complicated than the simple narrative of a loving son mourning a beloved mother. The public, hungry for clarity, began to speculate. What did he mean when he said her passing closed a chapter? Was it merely a poetic way of describing the end of her life, or was it an acknowledgement of the tensions her illness had created within the family? Social media lit up with theories. Some felt sympathy, understanding that dementia can create unbearable strain. Others were quick to interpret his words as a sign of unresolved conflict, perhaps even resentment. The truth, as is often the case in families, was likely somewhere in between, a mix of love, grief, exhaustion, and relief. This was not the kind of story that fits neatly into the glossy pages of a magazine profile. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect family photographs. It was about the messiness of real human relationships, even in the lives of people whose wealth might seem to shield them from life's cruelties. The billionaire who sends rockets into space could not escape the emotional gravity of watching his mother disappear piece by piece. The man who built an empire could not negotiate with a disease that ignores fortune, fame, and influence. The introduction to this story is not meant to answer every question, but to invite the viewer into a world they rarely see. The private corridors of a family in crisis, the whispered conversations in the late hours of the night, the strain that money cannot relieve. By the time we reach the heart of this story, we will see how dementia not only reshaped the bond between Jeff Bezos and his mother, but also exposed fractures within the family that may never fully heal. We will follow the journey from the first signs of change to the quiet moments after her passing, to the statement that left the world shocked, and finally to the questions that linger long after the cameras have moved on. In a space far removed from boardrooms and launchpads, from the roaring applause of product unveilings or the tense silence of investor calls. It begins in the quiet suburbs of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Jeff Bezos first opened his eyes to the world, and where the foundation for everything he would become was quietly laid. Before the global headlines and staggering wealth, before Amazon and Blue Origin, there was a boy whose life revolved around a small family anchored by a mother whose resilience would become legendary in the stories later told about her. But legends, when examined closely, are not without their cracks. Jackie Bezos was barely more than a teenager when Jeff was born. The story has been told in various interviews, how she faced down the disapproval of a conservative era, how she finished her education while raising a son, how she carved out a space for herself in a world that did not hand her anything. To the public, these details painted a portrait of unwavering strength. But inside the family, her determination came with its own complexities. She was fiercely protective, sometimes to the point of stubbornness. She made decisions without always explaining them, often driven by an instinct to shield her children from anything she perceived as harmful. In Jeff's early years, this manifested as an unshakable safety net. She was always there, always present, always in control of the environment around him. Jeff's relationship with his mother was not just one of affection, but also one of deep reliance. She was his confidant in the small struggles of childhood, the one who encouraged his tinkering with science experiments in the garage, who celebrated his fascination with books and technology. Yet, even as a boy, Jeff noticed that his mother carried herself with a kind of guardedness, a quiet awareness that life could turn unexpectedly, and that strength came from being prepared for those turns. That awareness, he would later learn, came from her own experiences with hardship, from knowing how quickly stability could crumble. As Jeff grew older, the relationship shifted in subtle ways. The boy who relied on his mother's constant presence became the young man who began to chart his own course, and that independence brought with it a natural tension. Jeff was ambitious, impatient with obstacles, and sometimes unyielding when he believed in a vision. Jackie admired these traits. They reflected the determination she had tried to instill in him, but they also meant that the two occasionally clashed. Their bond was strong, but like any relationship between two strong-willed people, it had moments of friction. In the public eye, however, there was no hint of strain. When Jeff's success with Amazon began to explode in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Jackie was often seen smiling proudly at events, standing in the background during ceremonies, or quietly sitting beside him at family functions. She preferred to stay out of the spotlight, but her presence was always felt. To those on the outside, she was the epitome of the supportive mother, gracious, composed, and proud. But family friends recall that behind the closed doors of private gatherings, conversations between Jeff and his mother could sometimes be sharp, not out of malice, but because both had strong opinions and neither liked to back down easily. This dynamic became even more pronounced as Jeff's fame grew. With every new milestone, from becoming the richest man in the world to launching rockets into space, the gap between their worlds widened. Jackie remained grounded in a life that valued simple routines and familiar comforts. Jeff was increasingly swept into a life of extraordinary demands and unimaginable pressure. While they still shared moments of closeness, there were times when their conversations seemed to happen across an invisible distance, as if they were speaking from different planets. And yet, despite these undercurrents, Jackie was a constant presence in Jeff's life. When the cameras were off and the boardrooms emptied, he often returned to her for advice, for grounding, for the kind of unfiltered truth that only a mother could give. She didn't hesitate to tell him when she thought he was wrong, and unlike most people in his orbit, she wasn't intimidated by his status. This was both a comfort and, occasionally, a source of frustration for him. The arrival of her illness began to blur the lines of that dynamic. At first, it was little things, forgetting an appointment they'd scheduled, misplacing objects, repeating questions she had already asked. Jeff noticed, but at first he chalked it up to stress, to the natural forgetfulness that can come with age. But as the pattern grew, the explanations became harder to cling to. Family members began to exchange worried glances during gatherings. There were moments when she seemed lost in a room full of familiar faces, her smile warm but her eyes distant. For Jeff, used to solving problems with precision and resources, it was an unfamiliar kind of helplessness. Here was a problem that no amount of capital could fix, no amount of innovation could outpace. The mother who had been his anchor was slowly drifting away, and there was no way to pull her back to shore. His visits became tinged with anxiety. Would she recognize him today? Would she remember the stories they had shared? It was during this period that the family began to close ranks, managing her appearances and carefully curating what the public would see. They were determined to protect her dignity, but this also meant that not everyone agreed on how much to share with the world. Some believed complete privacy was necessary, while others felt the truth could be a powerful message about the realities of dementia. These disagreements, though rarely visible to outsiders, left marks on the family's unity. Jeff, already navigating the relentless demands of his public life, now found himself balancing the emotional weight of his private one. There were days when he would leave a meeting about space exploration only to sit quietly at his mother's side, holding her hand while she stared out the window, her mind somewhere far away. There were also days when frustration bubbled over, not at her, but at the disease, at the unfairness of watching someone so strong become so vulnerable. In this chapter of their lives, the roles began to reverse. The protector had become the one in need of protection. The woman who had been the steady presence in his storms was now adrift, and Jeff had to learn to be her anchor. It was a lesson in humility, in patience, in accepting that some battles are fought not to win, but simply to stand by the person you love until the end. This was the quiet reality that few knew about while the public continued to see the smiling photographs and the rare public appearances. It was the reality that would shape the grief to come and the words he would later speak after her passing. And it was the reality that would lay bare the limits of even the most extraordinary power. Begins not with the onset of illness, but with the vivid, textured story of the woman at the center of this narrative before her final years were shadowed by decline. To understand the weight of her absence in Jeff Bezos's life, one must first understand the extraordinary arc of Jackie Bezos's journey, a story that began far from the corridors of wealth and power and was defined by grit long before it was ever touched by privilege. She was born into a world that did not offer her shortcuts. The small-town streets she grew up on were a place where neighbors knew each other's names, where work ethic was a matter of pride, and where life was built slowly, piece by piece. Jackie's early life was marked by a determination to chart her own course, even when that course seemed unlikely. She was not handed a life of ease. From a young age, she learned that stability was something you built yourself, often in the face of obstacles that could have easily derailed a weaker spirit. By the time she was a teenager, Jackie had already developed the resilience that would come to define her. She was intelligent and ambitious, but the path ahead was suddenly complicated when she became a young mother. Society at the time was not kind to girls in her position, and she faced skepticism, judgment, and outright dismissal from people who assumed her life's potential had been cut short. But where others might have seen the end of opportunity, Jackie saw a challenge she was determined to meet. She finished school, cared for her child, and began the quiet but relentless work of building a stable home. It was in these early years that she began to forge the deep bond with her son that would remain a constant throughout their lives. Jeff was not raised in an atmosphere of wealth, but in one rich with encouragement and intellectual curiosity. Jackie was the kind of mother who didn't just tell her child he could achieve anything. She built an environment where exploration and ambition were expected. Books filled their home, and ideas were discussed as if they were tangible things to be picked apart and rebuilt. If Jeff wanted to take apart the family radio to see how it worked, she didn't stop him. She asked him what he learned when he put it back together. Her encouragement was not the hollow cheerleading of someone merely telling a child to dream big. It was rooted in her own belief that limitations were often illusions, that perseverance could outlast circumstance. That belief would form the bedrock of Jeff's personality, long before anyone knew the scale of his ambitions. As Jeff grew, Jackie's life evolved as well. She married Mike Bezos, who would become Jeff's adoptive father, providing stability and support as the family relocated to Houston and later Miami. Jackie continued to balance the demands of motherhood with her own aspirations, eventually becoming involved in education initiatives and philanthropic work. She had a quiet but profound influence on the people around her, often choosing substance over recognition. It began, as the most consequential moments in life often do, with a single phone call. The sound of a ringtone pierced through the quiet of the Montecito estate, a quiet that was already fragile in a home where tension had been building for weeks. Prince Harry sat alone in a sunlit study, the California morning spilling through wide French doors, bathing him in a golden light that should have felt warm but instead felt oppressive. He glanced at the phone screen. The name there, Dominic Reed, made his stomach tighten. This wasn't just another polite conversation about schedules or charity updates. He knew, in the way one knows a storm is coming before the clouds arrive, that this call would change everything. For years, the Invictus Games had been his refuge. Born out of a genuine desire to give wounded veterans a platform to showcase resilience, it was the one project that seemed untouchable by scandal or criticism. It was his proof to the world, and perhaps to himself, that he was more than a tabloid headline. And Dominic Reed, the man on the other end of the call, had been there since the very beginning, loyal, pragmatic, fiercely protective of the game's integrity. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Harry pressed the phone to his ear. Dominic's voice was steady, but there was something uncharacteristically final in his tone. There was no room for small talk, no easing into the real reason for this conversation. The message came with a precision that cut through the air like a blade. The Invictus Games would be moving forward in 2027, but Meghan would not be welcome. And Harry himself faced a choice: return without her or risk losing his role entirely. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything Harry had heard in a long time. He didn't respond right away. Instead, his mind began pulling him backward through the years, back to the moment the Invictus Games were born, and to the image of Dominic shaking his hand with the firm resolve of a man who believed in both the cause and the prince. That handshake had meant trust. Now it was an ultimatum. Outside, the California sun remained indifferent to the shift in Harry's world. Inside, the silence between words was deafening. Dominic went on to explain the reasoning: concerns over public perception, the need to protect sponsors, whispers from within the veteran community about the games becoming more about celebrity image than the athletes themselves. Harry could almost hear, beneath Dominic's calm, the echo of countless conversations that had been had without him in the room, meetings where his name and Meghan's had been spoken in the same breath as problem and risk. The call ended with courtesy, but no comfort. Dominic thanked Harry for what he'd done for Invictus. He acknowledged his role as founder. But the subtext was clear: gratitude would not protect him from the consequences of his choices. Harry set the phone down and stared at it for a long time. He thought of Meghan, still upstairs, perhaps reading the news or tending to the children. He thought of the first Invictus Games in London, how the crowd erupted when veterans took to the track, the pride that swelled in his chest at seeing them cheered not as wounded soldiers, but as champions. That pride had carried him through so much. And now, it was being tested like never before. For all the warmth and progressive language around Invictus, it had always operated within a tightrope of diplomacy. Military veterans, government officials, international sponsors, media outlets, all had a stake in its image. In the early years, Harry had walked that tightrope with ease. But since marrying Meghan, the balancing act had become more complicated. Public perception was no longer a single current he could navigate. It was a storm of crosswinds, each gusting in different directions, each demanding a different version of himself. He remembered the 2023 Games in Sydney, where an awkwardly timed red carpet entrance overshadowed a medal ceremony. Or the whispered criticisms from behind the scenes about the way the focus shifted from the athletes to the Duke and Duchess. Dominic had never confronted him then, at least not directly. But Harry saw it in his eyes, concerns left unsaid but growing heavier over time. Now the weight had become too much to bear. Dominic was not a man who acted rashly. For him to ban Meghan from the 2027 Games meant that conversations had reached a breaking point months before this phone call. The decision had been marinated in pressure from sponsors, athletes, and perhaps even quiet nudges from powerful figures who preferred the Games remain free of any association they deemed controversial. Harry rose from his chair and walked to the window. From here, he could see the manicured gardens stretching toward the rolling hills. It was a peaceful view, but his mind was anything but calm. He thought about calling Dominic back, demanding an explanation beyond the polished phrases. But what would that achieve? The words had already been spoken. The Games were moving forward, with or without him. And then there was Meghan. How could he explain this to her without igniting the kind of fight that could leave scars? She had faced enough public rejection to last a lifetime, and this would be yet another headline. One more narrative for the tabloids to twist into their favorite storyline of conflict and exclusion. He could already hear the voices of commentators dissecting the move. Was Meghan the reason Harry lost Invictus? Has the Duchess become a liability? Those headlines would come, whether he spoke to them or not. In the days before this call, there had been signs that something was coming. A sponsor had pulled out unexpectedly. Emails from Invictus officials had grown formal and distant. Meghan had remarked, half-jokingly, that she felt she was being phased out of the games. Harry had brushed it off then, insisting that Dominic valued both of them. Now, he realized, she had seen the writing on the wall before he did. The question that now loomed in his mind was a brutal one. Could he attend the 2027 games without her and still live with himself? It wasn't just a matter of loyalty to his wife. It was about identity. For years, Harry had fought to control his own narrative, to step out from under the shadow of the monarchy and create a legacy on his own terms. Invictus had been that legacy. Walking away from it would feel like abandoning a part of himself. Staying without Meghan would feel like betraying her. The stakes were more than personal. The Invictus Games weren't just an event. They were a global platform for healing, solidarity, and inspiration. Harry knew that veterans looked up to him not just as a figurehead, but as someone who understood pain, loss, and the struggle to rebuild. Yet he also knew that for the games to survive, their leadership would sacrifice even him if they believed it was necessary. In Dominic's eyes, the games were bigger than any single person, even the man who founded them. Harry stayed at the window until the shadows shifted and the sun began to dip. The light changed, but the knot in his chest did not loosen. This was not a situation he could solve with a single statement or a carefully staged public appearance. It was a fracture in a relationship that had once felt unshakable, a fracture that now threatened to leave him standing on the outside of the very project he had built. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice told him this was only the beginning. The 2027 games were still years away. Between now and then, there would be negotiations, media storms, and perhaps opportunities to mend the rift. But there would also be more ultimatums, more impossible choices. And the question that would haunt him from now until that opening ceremony was not just whether he would be there, but whether he would be there alone. Before the tension, before the ultimatums, before the quiet estrangement between Prince Harry and Dominic Reed, there was only excitement. The Invictus Games had been born from a moment of clarity Harry experienced during a trip to the United States in 2013. He had attended the Warrior Games in Colorado, an event for wounded veterans, and was struck by the raw determination he saw in the athletes. Men and women missing limbs, scarred from war, but refusing to be defined by their injuries. They competed with an intensity and pride that left Harry unable to shake the thought. The United Kingdom, and indeed the world, needed something like this. In the early days, Harry's enthusiasm was contagious. His vision was ambitious but simple, to create an international sporting event for wounded, injured, and sick servicemen and women. A stage where they could prove, to themselves and to the world, that life after injury could be just as full, just as victorious, as before. The name, Invictus, was chosen with care. Latin for unconquered. It carried the spirit Harry wanted the games to embody. Dominic Reed entered the picture soon after. A decorated military veteran himself, Reed had the organizational discipline and network to make Harry's vision real. If Harry was the heart of the games, Dominic was the spine, quietly holding the structure together, ensuring that logistics, funding, and relationships were managed without fuss. The two men shared a mutual respect born from their understanding of the military mindset, loyalty, purpose, and an unspoken code of honor. By the time the inaugural Invictus Games were held in London in 2014, the project had already captured international attention. The opening ceremony at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park was a spectacle of unity. Flags from nations across the globe waved in the stands. Athletes rolled onto the field in wheelchairs, walked with prosthetics, or were guided by comrades, and the applause that greeted them was thunderous. Harry stood on the stage that night, delivering a speech that came from somewhere deep within him. He spoke of courage, of resilience, of the bond between those who had served. His voice wavered when he described how the games were not about what these men and women had lost, but about what they still had to give. Cameras caught his eyes glistening, a moment that was broadcast worldwide. For many, this was the first time they saw him not as a prince defined by royal protocol, but as a man with a mission. Dominic watched from the sidelines, making mental notes about the flow of the ceremony, but even he allowed himself a rare smile. The first games exceeded expectations. They attracted sponsorship from major companies, endorsements from heads of state, and coverage that painted both Harry and the games in an almost heroic light. It wasn't just an event, it was a movement. Veterans who participated often spoke of the games as life-changing. One former soldier from the Netherlands told reporters that he had been on the brink of giving up before training for Invictus gave him a new sense of purpose. A British veteran who had lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan described crossing the finish line as the moment he truly began to live again. These testimonies weren't scripted. They were raw, real, and deeply moving. Harry thrived in this environment. Away from palace intrigue and the relentless scrutiny of the tabloids, he found a community that embraced him for his actions rather than his title. He wasn't a royal on display. He was a comrade, a fellow veteran who had seen the cost of service. The athletes spoke to him with a familiarity they might never show to other public figures, and he returned that trust with genuine warmth. Dominic became more than an event organizer. He was a confidant. They spent long hours discussing the future of Invictus, often in quiet corners after long planning meetings. Both men knew the games had to grow without losing their soul. Expansion was the goal, but never at the cost of authenticity. Over the next few years, the games traveled the globe: Orlando in 2016, Toronto in 2017, Sydney in 2018. Each edition was bigger, more polished, but retained that core sense of purpose. In Sydney, Harry stood alongside competitors from 18 nations, his arm around a double amputee who had just completed the rowing finals. The image made front pages the next morning, a symbol of empathy and leadership. This was the period Harry would later look back on as the purest chapter of his work. There were challenges, of course, funding gaps, scheduling conflicts, the politics of international events, but the camaraderie and shared mission outweighed them all. Dominic was steady in his role, respected by sponsors, trusted by military liaisons, and valued by athletes. There was no hint, then, that cracks could form. No sign that the mission they had built together could one day be a source of division. Harry often spoke publicly about how Dominic was indispensable to Invictus, crediting him as the reason the games ran so smoothly. Privately, he admired the way Reed kept his head down and let results speak for themselves. At this stage, Meghan Markle was not yet part of Harry's life. The media coverage around the games focused on the athletes, the competition, and Harry's role as founder. Photographs from these years show a man deeply engaged, smiling broadly, sometimes wiping away tears during medal ceremonies. Sponsors saw a powerful, positive story, one that elevated their brand simply by association. Governments saw an opportunity to align themselves with an event that symbolized unity and resilience. The Invictus Games had become, without question, Harry's most successful venture. It was his proof that he could step out from the rigid royal mold and still lead something meaningful on the world stage. It was also the clearest example of his ability to connect across borders and cultures through a shared humanity that transcended politics. In the quiet moments between events, when the athletes had gone home and the applause had faded, Harry and Dominic would sit over a beer and talk about the future. They dreamed of Invictus becoming not just a biannual event, but a permanent institution with year-round training programs, scholarships, and rehabilitation support for veterans worldwide. They discussed bringing more nations into the fold, perhaps even former adversaries, to show the world that the human spirit could bridge divides war had created. It was during these years that Harry's trust in Dominic solidified. They had different temperaments. Harry impulsive, passionate, sometimes driven by emotion. Dominic methodical, calm, always thinking 3 steps ahead, but they balanced each other. That balance was part of why the game succeeded so completely in those early years. The glory days were more than just a honeymoon phase for Invictus. They were the foundation on which the event's credibility was built. Every handshake, every athlete's story, every medal awarded without regard to politics or celebrity status reinforced the message that this was an event for the veterans, by the veterans, and supported by those who truly understood them. What Harry could not have known then was that maintaining that purity of purpose would become the greatest challenge of all. That as the games grew in prominence, the pressures would grow too. Pressures that would test his relationship with Dominic, challenge the loyalty of sponsors, and ultimately force decisions that would feel like betrayals on both sides. For now, though, in those early days, there was only pride, camaraderie, and the sense that they were building something unbreakable. The applause of the crowds in London, Orlando, Toronto, and Sydney still echoed in Harry's memory. It was a time when every headline felt like a validation, every handshake a promise kept. And it was precisely because those days had been so pure, so full of hope, that the pain of what came later would cut so deeply. The year was 2016, and Harry's life was about to take a turn that would ripple into every corner of his personal and public existence. The Invictus Games had just concluded another successful chapter in Orlando, and Harry was basking in the kind of positive press that had eluded him in other areas of his life. There was an almost palpable sense of momentum. Veterans, sponsors, governments, and the media were united in praising the games. But in the quiet space after the event, Harry's personal world was about to change. It was around this time he met Meghan Markle, an American actress whose confidence and presence intrigued him instantly.